HoYoverse is bad at writing characters. I'm going to talk about why specifically they seem to fail so much at writing certain characters, whereas other ones they can do extremely well. We're in Genshin right now. I will be talking about Honkai Star Rail towards the later end because it has less characters to go through and less characterization and story moments to talk about. But in Genshin in particular, you have the issue of, for the vast majority of units we have in the game, they are perfectly fine as a character that you can play as. They're perfectly fine to travel along with the traveler throughout the game, throughout the story. It makes sense. They're fine as units, they're likable, and they're great friends. For others, it doesn't work. For other characters in particular, it kind of sucks trying to make them bend over backwards to essentially fit into a position to where they're on good terms. Child is an example. Actually, any of the Fatoui are perfect examples of this, because for the most part, none of them are on good terms with the traveler at all. So it's really difficult to go from a character who is perfectly willing to travel and actually associates on either balanced good terms or are great friends into a character who has historically hated the traveler or a character who attempted to kill the traveler. And so you have units that can have great starting points and can have really nice characterization and story moments in the beginning, but as they get closer and closer to their release, they have to bend over backwards, or the story has to shift entirely to making them not only likable, but also seem like they're on good terms with the traveler to an extent to where they'd be willing to travel with them. Yes, I name my Wanderer prototype because I refuse to forgive this character. But this hurts the Fatoui, and this hurts the possibility of any character showing what essentially amounts to any form of negativity towards the traveler at all. Now, don't get me wrong. Early on, I think we had some great candidates, some great units, especially the standard banner ones who are perfectly willing and would be willing to do so. But Tartaglia was the first Fatoui harbinger to try and get involved. And in his personality, doesn't really make sense to fit with the traveler. Yeah, he wants to fight. And yeah, theoretically, they can be great friends because the traveler fights a lot. But let's also be blunt here. Tartaglia has no real reason to associate with the traveler and vice versa. In Fontaine, we see the traveler distrusting Fatoui immediately. So that doesn't make sense when Tartaglia would otherwise be willing to play or travel with him. This extends even further once we get to Inazuma, because you have characters like Yaimiko and Raiden, who, Raiden especially, weren't on good terms with the traveler. Raiden tried to kill the traveler. If they had kept that train of thought to where Raiden was only amicable, with Yaimiko and the other Archons, it would have been fine. But because they shifted to make Raiden a much more likable character and friends with the traveler, you ended up in a position to where, well, now you either have her being really mean for no reason, or you give her a complex story reason. And what did we get? Well, she's actually a robot, but not really, but she's grieving. And it was the horrible main act of Inazuma, second act specifically, the first act of her story quest, which made her which essentially was a dating scene. It was really weird. It didn't fit with her character. The second story quest evolved on that, and I'm not going to say it was perfect, but it was way better. But the downside is the traveler essentially fits in the game as a unit that everyone else has to be on good terms with. We don't really have any villains that have stayed villains to the traveler. Wanderer, he is now a amicable associate who somehow gets along with him and gets along with Nahida, despite that being nothing like his original personality. And you had to essentially have the entire story legitimately rewrite this train of events from the very beginning to get him in a position to where he's in a spot that allows him to travel and disregards his past actions with the Fatoui. And so you have this position to where HoYoverse doesn't really, and is not really, willing to write any mean or evil or even morally gray characters, because the more morally gray they are, the more negative actions they do, the less likely you are to pull for them. And that is bad for money. That is bad for profit margins. And so you have to have characters either be really flirtatious to make up for it, like Lene here. A character essentially have an entire 180 on their story arc, like Raiden and like Wanderer. And with Wanderer specifically, both of these units, Raiden and Wanderer, have the exact same issue where they started off evil and on bad terms with the traveler, tried to kill them, and then proceeded to have some tragic backstory that made up for it. Raiden got 2 story quests. Wanderer had what really amounts to the worst variation of it, to where instead of them legitimately trying to dive into him as a character to make him likable, they instead erased the potential of that ever happening. And even though we have characters like Zhongli who are unaffected by the whole Armandsal thing, Raiden is. So it kind of removes the whole weight that the story could have, because not only are you ruining one character who is potentially really nice, but you're subsequently ruining any potential interactions or reason people would have to care. Because as much as this is the Wanderer, he subsequently is a different person in terms of the story itself, to where you can't really be invested in this person anymore, because he doesn't have his ties to the Fatoui anymore. He doesn't have his ties to the Raiden Shogun anymore. So it removes and worsens that. But on that end, Honkai Star Rail arguably follows suit in a much more different manner. Now, because you have alt selves and that you have alternate variations of characters, that obviously introduces some weirdness into the mix. But I don't know how HoYoverse writes in Honkai Impact 3rd, but I don't play the game, so I don't really care. So if we're just talking strictly about this game, you have the position to where characters, once again, aren't on good terms enough to be like, hey, we'll travel alongside you. You have some characters who are more or less morally good for their respective worlds, but you have others who really aren't, or are in that morally great position. And we haven't had any objectively evil characters, but the story itself still has to either make them somewhat likable to where they're not necessarily a completely deplorable individual, or make them somewhat vaguely interested in the Trailblazer enough to travel alongside them or work with them. But we also have the downside to where with Genshin you had much more in terms of the voice lines. Here you get very vague ones that don't really evolve much on the character themselves, so you get arguably a smaller and lighter character as a whole, which, yeah, obviously it works for the individual unit themselves. It works to have them be lighter and have less story impact. Silverwolf was barely there for the time of her banner. Jing Yuan got his showcase after his banner was up, which kind of sucks. Same thing with Kafka, who isn't necessarily even a character. Like, this is not a character. No. Anyway, before I rant about Kafka, HoYoverse is just bad at writing a range of characters. Arguably, yeah, we had Ting Yun and we had other units like Yukong. I think Yukong had great characterization in the story for what little was there. But in HSR, the story is much more condensed for each world and for each individual unit, that no one really gets a time to have any depth to them, at least compared to Genshin. And the downside of this is, yeah, Genshin's story isn't perfect. I understand that. And HSR can be better at times, but realistically, HSR is also carried a lot by the music and by the much more lighter tone, arguably. It has a lighter tone, but is able to display that through the jokes of the characters a lot of times, like March 7th, like the Trailblazer having a personality that the Traveler does not. The difference is Genshin is a much larger game, so you have to have characters have intermingling relationships. Because it's still one world as opposed to HSR's multiple worlds, one character is known by another character and associates with another one and associates with another one, and so on. So the personality has to remain consistent. So if you have a unit who has negative actions that you really can't delve into or can't really redeem them, erasing or in some way bending over backwards to make them seem good is the only option. And it ruins not only this character, but almost everyone else by association, strictly because in Wanderer's case, you don't have anyone else being able to delve into that concept and being able to delve into the actions he took and did, because they're gone. And in Raiden's case, you have two individuals, so the blame isn't on A, it's on the Raiden Shogun. When if you had just stuck with one, it would have been far better. You have Yae Miko, who theoretically is responsible for these two and has associations to them, but both of their situations essentially forbid any negativity from befalling onto her. And it just goes on and on. And yeah, don't get me wrong, the Genshin community is pretty bad at keeping characters, their personalities and their lore intact, because let's be honest here, everyone forgets half the time, and certain people decide to ruin the entire personality of certain characters and boil them down to one specific trait. But hey, that's just one thing. I think that HSR is probably going to have, hopefully at least, a better time because they focus so little on the actual character. And I'm not talking about companion quests, because I do think that the main quest of a world should evaluate and evolve more. And I think that if we're talking about character personality, the voice lines in Genshin have so much more. And even if we're excluding that, you have combat dialogue, you have the information, which is a lot, I think, better at least from my perspective, it could be better for you in HSR than Genshin. It doesn't matter. Either way, I am interested in how HSR chooses to go about their less good characters, because Genshin has done so poorly that it's really impossible to root for any antagonist, because you know they're not going to be an antagonist, and instead they're going to be made into some tragic good guy that was actually really badly written, or they're going to have essentially this unfathomably good personality to where no fault is of their own, and instead they're just a morally pure person like Nahida, who is, I think, to this day, one of the worst written characters. And yes, that is even worse than Raiden, because Raiden at least has some depth to it. Nahida is just extremely sweet, always forgiving, always in the right, never really in the wrong, doesn't harm anyone. But that's enough out of me for that one. Leave your thoughts down below. This was a little bit of rant, but I'll see you next time. Goodbye.